Imagine for a second that you live in a country with more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone on earth. You should be rich. Your government should be cutting you checks just for existing like they do in Dubai or Norway. But instead, you're standing in a supermarket aisle on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a stack of cash the size of a brick. And you're doing the math in your head, counting zeros, trying to figure out if this pile of bills is enough to buy a single carton of eggs. It's not. For 10 years, the world watched Venezuela collapse in slow motion and kept asking the same question. How long can he hold on? How long can one man's terrible decisions keep an entire country hostage? Well, on January 3rd, 2026, at exactly 2:01 in the morning, we finally got the answer. You're looking at the end of an era. Not with a whimper, but with a Delta Force raid, helicopter blades cutting through the Caracas night, and a one-way ticket to a federal detention center in Brooklyn, New York. Nicolas Maduro, the man who turned the richest country in South America into an economic graveyard, is no longer sitting in the Miraflores Palace giving speeches about imperialism. He's sitting in a cell wearing an orange jumpsuit, waiting to face narco-terrorism charges that have been hanging over his head for years. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. While the dictator is gone, the disaster he built is still standing. The hyperinflation that turned cash into toilet paper? Still there. The starving oil wells that used to pump black gold? Still broken. The ghost cities where entire neighborhoods fled to Colombia? Still empty. The handcuffs didn't magically fix the economy. So now we've got a new question, and it's scarier than the first one. Can a country actually come back from the dead? Or is the post-Maduro chaos about to be even worse than the dictatorship itself? Today, we're not just looking at the history of the collapse. We're looking at the wreckage that's left behind. This is the autopsy of the Maduro regime, and a hard look at the terrifying unknown that comes next. Let's get into it. Let's start with the raw numbers. Because if I just described the vibe, if I just told you things got really bad, you wouldn't understand the scale of this disaster. You need to see the math. You need to understand just how badly one government can screw up an economy. Picture the entire American economy. All of it. Apple, Amazon, Walmart, every factory, every farm, every office building from New York to Los Angeles. Now imagine if 80% of it just vanished. Poof, gone. No warning. Just erased from existence. That's exactly what happened to Venezuela between 2013 and 2025. This is the single largest economic contraction in modern history for any country not actively fighting a war. And I need you to understand how rare that is. Even when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, when the hammer and sickle came down and the entire communist system imploded, they only lost about 30 to 40% of their GDP. Maduro looked at those numbers and said, "Hold my beer, I can do worse." Here's the backstory, and it starts with a party that was way too good to last. When Nicolas Maduro took over as president in 2013, oil was trading at roughly $100 a barrel. The Venezuelan government was swimming in cash. The party was loud, the drinks were flowing, and nobody was worried about tomorrow. But the engine was already smoking. The warning lights were flashing, and everyone in the room was too drunk to notice. Venezuela had become completely addicted to oil. It made up 96% of their exports. Think about that for a second. 96%. They weren't producing anything else. No cars, no computers, no clothing, no nothing. They were importing everything. Food from Brazil, medicine from Europe, toilet paper from Colombia. The entire economy was a one-trick pony. And that trick was drilling holes in the ground and selling what came out. Then, in 2014, the price of oil crashed. This was the moment of truth. This was the fork in the road, where any halfway competent economist would have said, "Okay, we've got a problem. We need to cut government spending. We need to tighten our belts. We need to diversify the economy before this gets ugly." Instead, the Maduro administration chose option B, print money like it's confetti at a wedding. They looked at a budget hole the size of the Grand Canyon and decided the solution was to just add zeros to the currency. More bills, more cash, more bolivars flooding the market. It's like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. This triggered what economists call a negative supply shock. Basically, it became cheaper for businesses to shut down than to keep producing goods. Why? Because the money they'd spend on raw materials today would be worth more than the money they'd get from selling the finished product tomorrow. Inflation wasn't just rising, it was exploding. By 2019, annual inflation hit 344,000%. Let me put that in perspective for you, because that number is so big it stops making sense. Imagine you go to a coffee shop in the morning and buy a cup of coffee for $2. You finish it, you like it, and you decide to come back in the afternoon for a refill. You walk up to the counter, and the barista says, "That'll be $6,800. That's not economics. That's a glitch in the matrix. That's reality breaking down. The result? The bolivar, Venezuela's local currency, became functionally worthless. And I don't mean lost some value, I mean worthless in the most literal sense of the word. People stopped counting money. They started weighing it. You'd go to the market with a backpack full of cash just to buy bread. Stacks of bills sat in gutters because picking them up wasn't worth the effort. The paper itself was worth less than the energy it would take to recycle it. There are photos from this era that look like something out of a dystopian movie. Kids making origami birds out of 100,000 bolivar notes. Store owners using bricks of cash to prop open doors because it was cheaper than buying a doorstop. And here's the cherry on top of this economic disaster Sunday. While the economy was burning to the ground, the government stopped publishing data. They just ghosted the world. No more official GDP numbers. No more inflation reports. No more statistics. It was like a doctor refusing to take your pulse because they didn't want to confirm you were dying. We had to rely on independent observatories, underground economists, and leaked documents just to figure out what was happening. And what they found was horrifying. By 2021, the poverty rate had hit 90%. 9 out of 10 Venezuelans were living in poverty in a country that should have been one of the richest on earth. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The economy didn't die completely. It didn't flatline. Instead, it turned into something else. Something weird and broken and barely functional. It turned into a zombie economy. Still moving, but definitely not alive. To understand what I mean, we need to look at how Venezuela split into two completely different worlds, existing in the same place at the same time. And that's where things get really dark. If you walked through the upscale neighborhood of Las Mercedes in Caracas today, you would experience severe cognitive dissonance. Your brain would struggle to process what your eyes are seeing. On one side of the street, you'd see a Prada store, windows full of luxury handbags that cost more than most Venezuelans make in a year. Next door, there's a Bodegon, one of those fancy imported goods stores with shelves stocked floor to ceiling with Nutella, Kirkland signature vitamins from Costco, 18-year-old scotch, organic olive oil, and gourmet Italian pasta. You'd see people walking in, casually pulling out crisp $100 bills or opening their phones to make Zelle transfers in US dollars. Shopping like they're in Miami or Manhattan. This is Venezuela A. It makes up about 20% of the population, and it operates on what's called the dollar economy. This sector is fueled by three main sources of money. First, remittances. That's money sent back home by the millions of Venezuelans who fled the country A. ND are now working in Spain, Colombia, the United States, or anywhere that isn't Venezuela. They send dollars home to keep their families alive. Second, illicit gold mining. We'll get deep into that later, but just know that there's a massive underground economy of people digging gold out of the jungle and selling it for US dollars. And third, government contracting. If you've got connections to the regime, if you're selling construction materials or imported goods to the government, you're getting paid in dollars or euros. You're part of the elite. Now here's the crazy part. For years, the Venezuelan government banned the use of US dollars. It was illegal. They called it imperialism, economic warfare, a betrayal of the revolution. But eventually, around 2019, they realized they couldn't print their way out of trouble. So they quietly gave up. They effectively said, "Fine. Use the imperialist currency if you want. We don't care anymore. We surrender." And just like that, Venezuela became a de facto dollarized economy. Not officially. The bolivar still exists on paper. But in practice, if you've got dollars, you can live like a king. Now let me show you the other side of the coin. Then there's Venezuela B. This is the other 80% of the population. These are the teachers, the nurses, the janitors, the bus drivers, the pensioners, the people who built this country and are now watching it crumble around them. They're still being paid in bolivars, and those bolivars are worth about as much as monopoly money. Let me introduce you to a term that should not exist in any functional country, the war bonus. This is a real thing, because the official minimum wage in Venezuela is so laughably low. We're talking about the equivalent of a few dollars per month. The government pays workers a separate bonus. It's indexed to the dollar to keep people from literally starving to death. But here's the catch. It's not a salary. It has no benefits. It doesn't count toward your pension. It's not protected by labor laws. It's basically an allowance that can be revoked at any second if you complain, if you protest, if you say the wrong thing. It's a leash, not a paycheck. So what does life look like in Venezuela be? You're not shopping for Nutella. You're skipping meals. You're watering down the soup to make it last longer. You're dealing with something that Venezuelans darkly call the Maduro diet. That's not a joke. That's a real term. It refers to the weight that everyone lost because meat became a luxury item that only the rich could afford. Chicken, beef, pork, it all disappeared from the average person's plate. People lost 20, 30, 40 pounds not because they wanted to, but because there simply wasn't enough food. The inequality is absolutely staggering. Economists use something called the Gini coefficient to measure inequality in a society. It's a number between 0 and 100, where 0 means perfect equality and 100 means one person has everything. In 2024, Venezuela's Gini coefficient shot up to 53.9%, making it the most unequal country in the entire Americas. More unequal than Brazil, more unequal than Haiti, more unequal than anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere. So you've got this dystopian split screen playing out in real time. On one side of town, a guy in a tailored Italian suit is buying a 12-liter box of imported cereal for his kids. On the other side, a university professor with a PhD is dumpster diving behind a grocery store because his monthly pension is worth less than that box of cereal d'Aubar. That sink in for a second. A university professor, someone who spent decades studying, teaching, contributing to society, digging through trash to survive. ND. Here's the part that should make you angry. The government is fine with this arrangement. They're not trying to fix it. This isn't a bug in the system. This is the system working exactly as designed by Bob. Dollarization keeps the elite happy. It keeps the military fed. It keeps the people with power comfortable enough that they don't rock the boat. And the poverty keeps everyone else too busy surviving to organize, to protest, to revolt. If you're spending 12 hours a day trying to figure out how to feed your kids, you don't have energy left to march in the streets. You don't have time to join a political movement. You're just trying to make it to tomorrow. His is what economists call a stable equilibrium, not because it's good, not because it's fair, but because nobody has the power to change it. The rich want to keep their dollars, the poor are too weak to fight back, and the government sits in the middle, keeping the lights on just enough to maintain control. T's not a country anymore. It's a hostage situation. To understand how it got this bad, we need to talk about the one thing that should have made all of this impossible. We need to talk about the oil. Because Venezuela is sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth. And somehow, they still managed to screw it up. Okay. Now that old fable about the farmer who had a goose that laid golden eggs? Every day the goose would lay one perfect golden egg, and the farmer would sell it and live comfortably. But the farmer got greedy. He wanted all the gold at once. So he killed the goose, cut it open, and found nothing inside. Just a dead goose. Well, the Venezuelan government didn't just kill their golden goose. They plucked it. They deep-fried it. They sold the bones for scrap metal. And then they complained that the goose wasn't laying eggs anymore. This is the part of the story that drives economists completely insane. Because it should have been impossible to mess this up. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Canada, more than anyone. According to official estimates, they're sitting on roughly 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. In a logical world, every single Venezuelan citizen should be living like a prince in Dubai. The government should be so rich from oil money that they wouldn't even need to collect taxes. So what happened? How did oil production crash from 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to a pathetic 800,000 barrels today? The answer is a masterclass in how to destroy an industry through pure incompetence and corruption. It started way back in 2002, during the presidency of Hugo Chavez, Maduro's predecessor and mentor. There was a strike at PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. Workers were protesting Chavez's increasing control over the company. They wanted PDVSA to stay independent, to be run by professionals, not politicians. Chavez's response was legendary. Why in its stupidity? He went on live television, whistle in his mouth, literally blowing it like a soccer referee, and he fired 18,000 PDVSA employees on the spot, on live TV, in front of the whole country. Now, these weren't interns, these weren't janitors or secretaries, these were geologists, petroleum engineers, experienced managers who had spent decades learning the oil business. These were the people who actually knew how to run an oil company. And he replaced them with what? Political loyalists, people who knew everything about the Bolivarian Revolution, absolutely nothing about reservoir pressure maintenance, horizontal drilling, or refinery operations. It's like firing all the pilots at an airline and replacing them with people who've never flown a plane but are really enthusiastic about the company mission statement. Fast forward to the Maduro era, and the rot really set in. They stopped maintaining the equipment. Oil pipelines, which need constant inspection and repair, started developing leaks. Then the leaks became ruptures. Then the ruptures became environmental disasters with oil spilling into rivers and farmland. Refineries, which are incredibly complex facilities that need skilled engineers, started breaking down. Some literally caught fire because nobody was doing the maintenance. And when they broke, nobody knew how to fix them, because all the people who knew how to fix them had been fired or had fled the country. And then there's the corruption. Oh boy, the corruption. This wasn't just skimming a little off the top. This wasn't some bureaucrat taking home office supplies. This was industrial-scale looting. This was theft at a level that would make a mafia boss blush. In 2023, a scandal broke that $21 billion in oil revenue had just gone missing, vanished, disappeared. Nobody knows where it went. $21 billion. For context, that's roughly the entire GDP of El Salvador. That's the economic output of an entire country. Just gone. The former oil minister, Tarek El-Aissami, was arrested. He was supposed to be in charge of the oil industry. But the money? Never seen again. It's probably sitting in bank accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, or Dubai. It's probably been converted into luxury real estate in Miami, yachts in the Mediterranean, or crypto wallets that can never be traced. But it's definitely not in Venezuela helping Venezuelans. The state of the oil industry today is almost comical if it wasn't so tragic. Venezuela is sitting on more oil than almost anyone on earth, and yet they literally have to import gasoline from Iran. Read that again. They have to import gasoline from Iran because their own refineries can't process the crude oil they're sitting on. It's like living in a bakery and starving to death because you fired the baker and sold the oven for scrap metal. The oil that they do manage to extract and sell is going to China and Iran at massive discounts because those are the only countries willing to buy it under US sanctions. They're selling dollar bills for 50 cents just to get some cash flow. And here's the thing that really hurts. It didn't have to be this way. Mexico has oil. They managed it professionally, and while they've had their problems, they didn't collapse their entire industry. Norway has oil. They put the money in a SOVE, Iran Wealth Fund, and now every Norwegian citizen benefits from it. Even Saudi Arabia, which is basically a monarchy in the desert, managed their oil industry well enough to build a modern economy. But Venezuela took the golden goose and systematically destroyed it through incompetence, corruption, and ideological blindness. And the human cost of that decision is staggering. Because when the oil money dried up, when the government couldn't pay for food imports anymore, when the economy collapsed, millions of people had to make an impossible choice: stay and starve, or leave everything behind and run. If the economy is the crime scene, this is the body count. Since 2014, over 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. Some estimates put it closer to 8 million. That's roughly 25% of the entire population. To put that in perspective, imagine if the entire population of Texas just packed up and walked away. Every person in Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio gone. That's the scale we're talking about. This isn't migration. This isn't people looking for better job opportunities or moving for school. This is a mass exodus. This is people fleeing a humanitarian catastrophe, and the journey out is a nightmare. You've probably heard of the Darien Gap. It's this dense, lawless stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama, about 60 miles of pure hell. No roads, no infrastructure, just mud, rivers, snakes, and criminal gangs who prey on desperate migrants. It's been called the most dangerous migration route in the world. In 2023 and 2024, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans walked through that jungle. Doctors, teachers, engineers, mechanics, people who used to have normal lives, carrying their children on their shoulders, wading through rivers where the current could sweep you away, stepping over the bodies of people who didn't make it. Think about what it takes to make that choice. Think about how bad things have to get in your home country before you're willing to put your kids through that. The stories that came out of the Darien Gap are heartbreaking. Parents who lost children to the river and couldn't stop to mourn because they had to keep moving. Women who were assaulted by gangs and had no one to report it to because there's no law in the jungle. People who died from dehydration, exhaustion, or snake bites within sight of Panama, but they kept coming. Because even the Darien Gap was better than staying in Venezuela. The ones who made it through scattered across South America. Colombia took in millions. Peru, Chile, Ecuador. They all saw massive waves of Venezuelan refugees. Some made it to Mexico. Some made it to the United States. Some made it to Spain, where there's a large Venezuelan diaspora. And here's what makes this even more tragic. The people who left weren't the deadweight of society. They were the ambitious ones, the educated ones, the skilled workers. The hospitals in Caracas are now empty of specialists because all the good doctors are driving Ubers in Madrid or working in clinics in Miami. The universities are ghost towns because the professors left to teach somewhere they could actually get paid. The engineering firms are staffed by whoever was left behind after all the talent fled. This is called brain drain, and it's one of the most devastating things that can happen to a count. Rye. You lose the people who could have rebuilt the economy. You lose the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the problem solvers. Venezuela didn't just lose people, it lost its future. But here's the dark, twisted irony of the whole situation. The Maduro regime actually benefits from this mass exodus. First, fewer mouths to feed. The people who left were usually the angriest, the most desperate, the most likely to protest. If they leave, they can't cause trouble at home. Problem solved. Second, remittances. Those people who fled, a lot of them are sending money back home to keep their parents, their grandparents, their siblings alive. Billions of dollars flow back into Venezuela every year from Venezuelans working abroad. And where does that money go? Into the economy, into businesses, into the hands of the government through taxes and exchange rates. The regime is being propped up by money sent from the very people they forced to flee. It's a perverse cycle of survival. The government creates a disaster. People flee the disaster. Those people send money home out of love for their families. That money stabilizes the government that created the disaster in the first place. And the regime knows this. They're counting on it. As long as millions of Venezuelans are working abroad and sending money home, the economy stays just functional enough to keep the government in power. It's like a parasite that's evolved to make sure its host doesn't die completely, just stays sick enough to keep feeding the parasite. And the tragedy is that everyone involved knows how wrong this is. The people who left didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay in their country, near their families, in the place where they grew up. But the choice was made for them by corruption, by incompetence, by a government that chose power over people. And now, with Maduro sitting in a Brooklyn jail cell, everyone's asking the same question: will they come back? Will those 8 million Venezuelans who scattered across the world return home now that the dictator is gone? Or is the damage too deep? Is the economy too broken? Are the scars too fresh? Because here's the thing about brain drain. It's easy to lose your talent. It's incredibly hard to get it back. Now, you might be sitting there asking a very reasonable question. If the oil industry collapsed, if the economy shrank by 80%, if millions of people fled, how does the government still have money? How are they still paying the soldiers? How are they buying riot gear and surveillance equipment? How is Maduro still living in a palace while everyone else is starving? Welcome to the shadow economy. Welcome to the part of the story that reads like a crime thriller. When the oil money dried up, when the legitimate economy collapsed, Maduro looked south at the map of Venezuela. Down there, you've got pristine jungle, indigenous tribes who've lived there for thousands of years. And underneath all of that, gold, lots and lots of gold, plus coltan, diamonds, and other valuable minerals. So in 2016, the government created something called the Arco Minero del Orinoco. It's a mining zone bigger than Portugal. And they opened it up for business. But they didn't bring in legitimate mining companies with environmental regulations and worker protections. Instead, they handed control to criminal syndicates, guerrilla groups like the ELN from Colombia and military generals who saw it as a chance to get rich. It's what some analysts call a pra-nado, a mafia state system where criminal organizations and the government are basically the same thing. What happens in that jungle is horrifying. They use mercury to separate gold from the ore. That mercury poisons the rivers. It gets into the fish. It gets into the people who eat the fish. Indigenous communities are displaced with violence that would make a horror movie director flinch. Women and children are trafficked. Workers are basically slaves. And where does all this gold go? It doesn't go into the official budget where anyone can track it. It's loaded onto private planes in the dead of night and flown to places like Turkey or the United Arab Emirates. There, it's swapped for cash or euros. That money comes back in suitcases and duffel bags to fund the shadow state. This is how you keep the lights on in the presidential palace, while the rest of the country sits in darkness. And then there's the crypto angle. Oh boy, the crypto angle. In 2018, Venezuela launched something called the Petro. It was supposed to be the world's first state-backed cryptocurrency, pegged to the country's oil reserves. The government hyped it up as a way to evade US sanctions and enter the digital economy. It was a complete scam, a total failure. Nobody trusted it, nobody used it. It died quietly. But here's what the government did learn from that experiment. They learned how to use cryptocurrency to move money around without getting caught. Remember that $21 billion oil scandal I mentioned earlier? A huge chunk of that money was moved off cryptocurrency wallets. Bitcoin, Tether, other coins. It was laundered through exchanges, converted to different currencies, moved across borders, all while leaving a trail so complicated that even forensic accountants couldn't follow it. The US Treasury tried to track it. They tried to freeze accounts. But by the time they figured out where the money was, it had already moved somewhere else. So let's be clear about what we're looking at here. This isn't an economy anymore. It's not based on production, trade, taxes, or any of the normal things that make a country function. It's a criminal enterprise disguised as a country. It runs on illicit gold from enslaved miners, laundered oil money sent to China and Iran, and cryptocurrency transactions designed to hide the money trail. And here's the most disturbing part. It works. It's sustainable enough to keep the regime in power. The generals get rich, the enforcers get paid, the elite get their dollars, and everyone else? Everyone else gets to survive on scraps. This is the economy that Maduro built. Not an economy of opportunity, but an economy of extraction. Not wealth creation, but wealth theft. And it kept him in power for over a decade. Until it didn't. If the economy was the crime scene, July 28, 2024 was the moment when the killer tried to frame the jury. For a brief, shining moment in 2024, it looked like there might be an off-ramp. It looked like maybe, just maybe, Venezuela could escape this nightmare through an actual election. The opposition had finally united. After years of infighting, after being divided and conquered, they'd come together behind one candidate. His name was Edmundo Gonzalez. He was a quiet, grandfatherly diplomat, not flashy, not a firebrand, just a calm, decent man who promised to fix what was broken. Now, the real leader of the opposition was a woman named Maria Corina Machado. She was electric, she was fearless. She drew crowds in the tens of thousands everywhere she went. People loved her, but the government had banned her from running for office. Because of course they did. When your opponent is too popular, you don't debate them. You disqualify them. So she campaigned for Gonzalez instead. And she campaigned like a woman possessed. She traveled to every corner of the country that would have her. She spoke in town squares, in churches, in people's living rooms. The energy was incredible. The polls showed the opposition winning. Not just winning, but winning by a landslide. We're talking 30, 40 points ahead. It wasn't even close. Then came election night. Independent pollsters and exit polls showed González winning with roughly 67% of the vote. International observers said the same thing. The opposition was winning in a blowout. But then something strange happened. The National Electoral Council, the CNE, which is basically Maduro's PR department, went dark. For 6 hours, there was nothing. No updates, no announcements, just silence. People waited. The world waited. And then, just after midnight, the CNE came back online with an announcement. Maduro wins with 51% of the vote. They didn't show the paper receipts from the voting machines. They didn't show the data. They didn't show their math. They essentially just said, "Trust us." But the opposition had receipts. Literal receipts. Before the CNE could seize all the voting machines, opposition volunteers had collected the printed tally sheets from thousands of polling stations. These are the official records that each machine prints out, showing how many votes were cast for each candidate. They scanned them. They uploaded them to a website. And the world could see the math, the real math. González had won, by a lot. And Maduro looked the world dead in the eye and said, "I don't care what the numbers say, I'm staying." What followed wasn't a peaceful transition of power. It was a purge. The government launched something called Operation Ton. The secret police, the SEBIN, started going door to door. They arrested over 2,000 people in the weeks following the election: students, activists, opposition volunteers. Anyone who had celebrated González's victory, anyone who had posted the wrong thing on social media. González himself was forced to flee. He escaped to Spain, where he remains in exile today, and Maduro stayed in power. Not because he won, but because he had the guns. This was the final nail in the economic coffin. The United States had been cautiously optimistic. They'd eased some sanctions, hoping that maybe Venezuela was turning a corner. But after the stolen election, they slammed those sanctions right back into place. Foreign investors who had been sniffing around, thinking maybe Venezuela could be the next big turnaround story, they packed their bags and ran. Nobody wanted to invest in a country where the government just brazenly steals elections on live television. The brief economic stabilization that had happened in 2023 and early 2024 was exposed for what it really was, a house of cards built on hope and fear, and now the cards were falling. But Maduro had won. He'd stolen the election. He'd crushed the opposition. He'd survived sanctions before, and he'd survived them again. He must have felt untouchable. He must have thought he could do this forever. Keep the military happy. Keep the elite fed. Keep the poor too scared to fight back, and ride it out until the world got tired of caring. He was wrong, because 6 months later, in the middle of the night, Delta Force was coming for him. Let's talk about how it ended, because for a long time it looked like Nicolas Maduro was untouchable. He survived the 2019 coup attempt when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and half the world recognized him. He survived the 2020 failed invasion, the so-called Bay of Pigs fiasco with American mercenaries. He survived the 2024 stolen election and the international outcry that followed. He'd been under a US indictment for narco-terrorism since 2020. There was a $50 million bounty on his head, the largest reward ever offered for a foreign head of state. But he was safe as long as he stayed in Venezuela, surrounded by loyal guards, protected by the military, insulated in his palace. Until January 3, 2026, at exactly 2:01 in the morning. The operation was codenamed Absolute Resolve, and it was surgical. According to reports that leaked out afterward, the CIA had assets inside Venezuela since August 2025. They'd been tracking Maduro for months. His movements, his security detail, his daily patterns, what he ate for breakfast, when he went to bed, everything. They knew he'd be in Caracas that night. They knew which room he'd be sleepy in. They knew how many guards would be on duty, and when the moment came, it was fast. Brutally fast. A fleet of helicopters descended on the presidential compound. Over 150 jets had launched from 20 different air bases to create a no-fly zone over Caracas. Anyone who tried to scramble Venezuelan fighter jets found their runways destroyed before they could take off. Delta Force soldiers breached the palace. They moved through the building like ghosts. 30 minutes from entry to extraction. That's how long the whole operation took. Maduro was sleeping next to his wife, Celia Flores, when they burst into the room. According to one anonymous official who spoke to reporters, He tried to run to a steel-reinforced safe room he'd built specifically for this kind of scenario. He didn't make it. He was tackled, cuffed, and dragged out in his pajamas. His wife was taken too. Both of them were loaded onto a helicopter, flown to a US military base, and then put on a plane to New York. By the time the sun rose over Caracas, Maduro was in American airspace, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. President Trump watched the whole thing in real time from a secure room at Mar-a-Lago. He later described it to reporters as like watching a television show, praising the speed, the violence, the precision. At least 40 people were killed in the operation. Venezuelan military personnel who tried to resist. Some civilians caught in the crossfire. The exact number is still classified. Russia condemned it immediately, called it an illegal invasion, a violation of sovereignty, an act of imperialism. China issued a stern statement. Cuba claimed that 32 Cuban nationals, presumably advisors to the Maduro regime, were killed in the strikes. But none of that mattered. Maduro was gone. The dictator who'd ruled Venezuela for over a decade was now sitting in a federal detention center in Brooklyn, waiting for trial on charges of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and conspiring with foreign terrorist organizations. The narcotics charges stem from years of evidence that Maduro worked with Colombian guerrillas, Mexican cartels, and his own military to move cocaine through Venezuela and into the United States and Europe. Prosecutors have phone intercepts, financial records, and testimony from informants. If convicted, he's looking at life in prison. Back in Venezuela, chaos erupted. The Supreme Court, still packed with Maduro loyalists, ordered Vice President Delcy Rodriguez to assume acting presidential powers. But nobody's really sure if she's in charge, if the military's in charge, or if the country is just rudderless. The streets of Caracas erupted in celebration. People poured into the plazas, waving flags, crying, hugging strangers. Venezuelans in exile from Spain to Miami held parties. For one night there was hope, but then the sun came up, and everyone had to face reality. The dictator was gone, but the disaster he built was still there. So here we are. Nicolas Maduro is sitting in a Brooklyn jail cell, and Venezuela is standing at a crossroads. The zombie economy is still stumbling forward. The bolivar is still worthless. The oil wells still broken. The hospitals are still empty. The 8 million people who fled are still scattered across the world. The inequality is still crushing. The corruption is still everywhere. Removing one man didn't magically fix a decade of destruction. And that's the question everyone's asking. Can a country actually come back from the dead? History gives us mixed answers. Germany rebuilt after World War II, but they had the Marshall Plan and billions in aid. Japan rebuilt, but they had American support and protection. Rwanda recovered from genocide, but it took decades and authoritarian leadership. Venezuela's challenge is different. They still have the oil, they still have the gold, they still have the natural resources. But they've lost something harder to rebuild: trust, institutional knowledge, human capital. The engineers who knew how to run the oil industry are driving Ubers in Madrid. The doctors are in Miami. The teachers are in Colombia. The entrepreneurs who could rebuild the economy are scattered across 4 continents. Can you convince them to come back? Would you come back, knowing that the corruption is still there, that the military is still powerful, that the same people who enabled Maduro are still in positions of power? And even if they do come back, how long does it take to undo 80% GDP collapse? How do you restart an oil industry that's been neglected for 15 years? How do you rebuild trust in a currency that people used as toilet paper? The IMF is already predicting that Venezuela's GDP will contract another 4% in 2025 and 5.5% in 2026. Inflation is projected to hit over 600%. In some estimates, maybe 800%, pushing the country back toward hyperinflation. This doesn't get better quickly. This is a generation-long project. But here's the thing that gives me a sliver of hope. For the first time in over a decade, the ceiling has been lifted. The variable that made recovery impossible, the dictator himself, is gone. Change can happen now. Not easily, not quickly, but it can happen. Venezuela can start publishing real economic data again. They can invite legitimate oil companies to help rebuild PDVSA. They can reform the currency. They can fight corruption. They can start building institutions that work for the people instead of looting them. None of that was possible while Maduro was in power. Now it is. Whether it actually happens is another question entirely, because the ghosts of the Maduro era are still there. The generals who got rich off gold mining, the elites who benefited from the dollar economy, the criminal networks that run the shadow economy. They're not going to give up their power quietly. So the real question isn't just can Venezuela recover, it's does Venezuela have the strength to fight for its own recovery? Because this is the moment. This is the fork in the road. The country can either seize this opportunity to rebuild, to become what it was always supposed to be, or it can slide into a different kind of chaos, where competing factions fight over the scraps while ordinary people keep suffering. The autopsy is complete. Maduro's regime is dead. But whether Venezuela itself can come back to life, that story is just beginning.